Hi, my name's Cecilia Puna, and welcome to this episode of Brave New Women. All around the world, there are amazing, ordinary women doing extraordinary things. Brave New Women is about giving those women a platform and a voice, and it's about changing the way that women are perceived. And it's a way of inspiring all of us to do the things that we've always wanted to do. I have great pleasure to welcome Lilian Sue to the podcast today. Lilian is in the storytelling and relationship building business. She's a PR coach and publicist, and she teaches the creative entrepreneurs she works with how to build and launch PR campaigns that achieve their goals and help their stories gain worldwide recognition. I'm talking to Lilian a little bit about her business, but I'm talking to her more about growing up in a very traditional Chinese Canadian family and the difficulties that she's had in pushing against the cultural traditions and the strict family roles, and what it's meant to her to live the life that she wanted. So welcome, Lilian Sue.
Thanks for having me, Cecilia. I'm happy to be here.
Lilian, I'd like to start a long way back. I'd like to start with your grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could just tell me a little bit about their story. How did they come from China to be living in Canada?
Well, my maternal grandparents were, they were 16 and 17 by the time the war ended. And my great-grandmother at the time, her primary fears were that she wanted to protect my grandmother from being accosted by the soldiers. Her thought process at the time was that if a soldier touches you, no man will want you. So somehow through an intermediary, she had arranged for my grandmother to marry my grandfather. So, here they are in their early 20s. They just had a daughter who didn't make it that far past birth before having my mother. So for all intents and purposes, my mother is the oldest of 5. They had my mother, 2 years later had my uncle, and they made the decision to leave. And at that time, the Canadian government was doing a little bit of family reunification and things like that, based on my understanding. And they only had enough money, I think, to kind of take my uncle with them. So my mother and my uncle had to move to Hong Kong first with their grandmother, my grandfather's mother. And they stayed there for a period of years before my uncle made the journey with my grandparents overseas here to Canada. My mother made a much more circuitous route that saw her spend 2 years in Argentina with her grandparents. I still remember her telling me that it was a 60-day boat trip from Hong Kong to Argentina, and she remembers stopping at the port in Cape Town, but they wouldn't let them off the boat because of racial policies in those days. This would have been 65. So
they went around underneath South Africa.
And she spent 2 years in Argentina as a teenager before coming over at the age of 17. By then, I had 2 more uncles and an aunt who were born on Canadian soil. My youngest uncle, who was a newborn, my mother actually spent the first 6 years of his life before she married my father, babysitting my youngest uncle and my middle uncle and my aunt. That was kind of her primary role because my grandmother had gotten so sick during her last pregnancy. So that's kind of how things worked out for my maternal side. My paternal side...
So your mother hadn't seen her parents for, on 17 years.
Actually, it was more, I'd say 12, maybe 10 to 12.
Wow.
But, because they had left Hong Kong when she was young. But on the paternal side, it was also an arranged marriage, as my understanding. They had they also lost a son very early in life before having my dad. And after my dad, it was my aunt, and then my uncle was born about 9 years or so after my dad was. And by that time, on that side of the family, the decision was made because my great grandfather, who had come over to work on the railroad, wanted to sponsor my dad and his cousin over to Canada. And they had to kind of, quote unquote, fudge the applications, so to speak, so that when my grandfather filled that out, or how he had helped to fill that out, he claimed my dad and his cousin as his sons, not his grandsons.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad and his cousin made the move over. This would have been 57. So it was a full 10 years before my mother came to the country. And my dad was about 9 years old. And from the time he was 9 to when he was, going to say 27, 28, my dad didn't see his parents or his younger brother, my uncle, again.
Wow.
So while my mother had more family around in her upbringing, she still had the responsibilities of being the oldest and being the oldest daughter and being the caregiver. My dad basically had to raise himself because my great grandfather would come home. In those days, he worked at a cannery in the suburbs, and in those days with buses and trolleys, it was probably at least a couple hours each way because nobody drove. So he would come home once a week, dump the money on the kitchen table, and he was gone again. So it was really my dad and his cousin who raised themselves, and my dad, had the wherewithal to put himself through school. And then in a roundabout way, when he was wanting to learn Tai Chi, somehow through the old Chinatown network in those days, got connected with my grandfather, who was a sifu in his life. And he started taking lessons from him, and that's how my parents met. And they dated for about 6 years before getting married in 72, the same year that they bought the property that the house I grew up in would later be built on. My brother was born 2 years later in 74, actually on their wedding anniversary. So I always laugh and I said, well, there really is no excuse for forgetting your anniversary, because then you'd also be forgetting your firstborn's birthday. I'm just saying. But 2 years after that was when they finally had enough money to sponsor both my grandparents and my uncle from China. So they didn't get here until 76. And at that time, with the house that they were living in, quarters were cramped. My grandparents lived in the attic right above my brother's room, and they used to, from what I have heard, argue like cats and dogs. They just did not get along. And for my grandfather ended up passing in 90. And for the bulk of that 14 years that, they were in Canada for when they first got here, I believe they had actually separated at some point, and he just lived down at Chinatown by himself. Eventually, when my uncle married my aunt and he moved out, my grandmother went with them. So by the time I was born, with the quote unquote new house at that time was about 7 years old, then it was just my parents and my brother living on that piece of property. And looking back on it, in some level, I really sort of think that there was some element of luck involved. I mean, you think about it. At the time they got married, my parents were 23 and 24, respectively, new homeowners, um, who had just bought a house on a plot of land that my dad had heard inklings about. They were going to put in a transit system at the end of our block. Sure enough, that started going in about a year and a half to 2 years before I was born, which of course really raised our property values. But it was smart for him to buy there because he had heard those inklings, and that was that little bit of luck at play. And then in spending the first 4 years of their marriage sponsoring the family back in China to come over, I mean, I've heard this a lot growing up. They didn't have a cent to their name. If anything had happened, the whole family would have been underwater, but they made it work.
I mean, what really strikes me about both your parents' stories are that they were really thrown. I mean, they were basically without parents from a very young age, and your mother was with her grandparents, but not with her parents, and really having to taking on very adult roles from a very young age. And I imagine that would have been. It almost feels as though they were deprived of their childhoods, and that they were deprived of the parental care that maybe they needed.
In all honesty, I don't know that many in their generation who grew up similarly knew what it meant to have a childhood, if there was even really a word for it. But they both knew from a very young age the responsibilities that came with being the eldest. And for my mother in particular, the responsibilities that came with being the eldest of such a large family, because the responsibilities were placed on them both from very young ages. I mean, my father made the choice to put himself through technical school when he had nothing and nobody.
And that's an extraordinary decision. I think it would take extraordinary courage to do that, and perseverance.
And he came out an engineer. Mm. And an engineer was what he worked at for 3.5, 4 decades by the time he finally retired. And so growing up in that, and given that there is very much a large age gap between my brother and I, as I understand it, when my mother had my brother, she ended up very ill. I think for different reasons than when my grandmother had my youngest uncle, but my mother had also been very ill. And I don't think, because of that, had planned to have another one.
Mm-hmm.
So, surprise, here I come, at a time where it was pretty uncommon for women in their late 30s, in the late 80s, to have children at that age. And for myself, I also came out with some complications. I was born early. I had to spend an extra 5 months at the hospital, and kind of came out with some mobility issues in that. And when people talk to me about resilience, I'm like, well, my birth is a good story of that, because based on that time period and based on, the difficulties a lot of premature children and babies had at that time, there's no reason I should be here. But I came through that and had to learn how to work within my limitations my entire life. I mean, when I was little, I had specialized therapy I'd have people come to the house and do activities with me. And I have vague memories of uh, playing certain things with them, like with toys and stuff like that. But it was really to help me improve my dexterity and my coordination. I remember using things like different scissors at school to make it easier for me to grip. That was primarily the reason why my parents, from when I was 5 to when I was 21, I had piano lessons under the same teacher. Um, and that was primarily the reason why they put me in piano, is to improve my coordination and dexterity and things like that. And through that, as difficult as it was for me to really get into the lessons, I think I personally probably would have responded to it better had my teacher been. I mean, I loved her dearly. I still love her. I invited her, to my wedding and everything. But she was very by the books, as in, I teach my students uh, lessons in order to have them go through the exams and eventually become teachers themselves. Right. So there wasn't anything pop culture related, anything on the radio, and that my cousins and I, who, as luck would have it, also went to the same teacher, we would have to go out and buy ourselves. Mm-hmm. So, there was in the midst of some of this resilience and this adversity, and also having a much older brother who to this day I love dearly. We are very, very close. But growing up, in spite of the fact that I was not around for his childhood, I always used to hear stories about the type of freedom he used to get in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, he would take the bus by himself at 10 years old and go downtown. I was not afforded this same kind of freedom. Where he had the freedom, I had much stricter rules. I, had to do the piano. I had to do the Chinese school. I had to do the extracurricular math, because that's what my parents set out for me. That's what they believed would support me the most physically and also in school. And that's where it ended. So growing up, there was really no talk or any support of other extracurriculars, or fostering my own interests or things like that.
So you just basically had to do, your parents decided for you, and you just had to do what they said.
Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the bulk of where my free time outside of school went. Swimming lessons was another one as well for the first decade of my life. Is
it possible for you to rebel against that?
I did. We butted heads a lot over my lack of desire to practice piano as a really big one. I love music. I really appreciate music. I can look back and appreciate the skills and sort of the ear that taking all those years of piano lessons has given me. But at the time, I really rebelled against the rigid structure of, you have to practice these songs in order to work your way towards the exams. I mean, I still did the exams, but it was less of a forward progression because I wanted to, and more of a dragging, kicking, and screaming.
Mm-hmm. What would you have been if you hadn't been doing the things that your parents had decided for you? What would you have been doing?
I've always had a lifelong love of writing. And this is something that originally, that in my high school years, I had actually toyed with making a living as a novelist. But given that this was pre-self-publishing, and the competition was much fiercer on the traditional side, it was something that I ended up putting on the back burner. But I'd always loved writing just for fun, poetry, short stories, that sort of thing. I had a fantastic English teacher in my last year of high school who came across some competitions for a couple of short story anthologies, and he said, hey, I think you should enter. I think you would have a really great shot at being featured. And thanks to him, I was published twice by the time I graduated high school, and I've always kind of held that with me. And it's interesting because these days I'm finally taking that dream full circle. In the middle of doing my day job, I'm also working on 2 books with more book ideas to come. And I'm really enjoying it. I'm having a lot of fun with the process of writing, and it's always been something that I've just really enjoyed doing as an emotional release, as a creative exercise. It can be really cathartic to write as well. And that was something that I think I always wish I had more support in my childhood from my nuclear family on that subject. I'm always grateful to the teachers that I have, absolutely. But that was, for the first 15 years of my life, I was sort of left to my own devices on just writing for fun.
Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing a real sort of cleavage between you enjoying writing, a lot of creativity, a lot of emotional release, and your parents who were pushing you to do piano lessons really to get through the exams and for mobility, and also extracurricular maths. And so I can see that there would be a huge tension in that.
Grades were really important in my household, not to, fulfill the Chinese stereotypes, but there is truth to that. That it was really important. And I understand why, looking back at it to an extent, because my mother didn't go to college until midway through her professional career. She and my aunt went back to night school together. And as I said earlier, my dad put himself through school. And for them, getting those good grades equals getting that good job, equals getting that financial stability that you work towards in order to make sure that you're secure and your family is secure. I've always understood that point of view from them. But what I always rebelled against was the rigid structure of that point of view. Because I always believe that if financial stability is what you're looking for, there's not always one right way to go about getting that, because what's right for someone else is not always going to be right for you. And that wasn't something that they were willing to entertain.
So did that lead to a rift at some stage with your parents?
I would say that the last 10 years I lived at home were particularly difficult, because by that time, my brother had moved out of the house. He had gone to chiropractic college in the States and then stayed in Seattle. And he left home at 24. I was 11. So I spent the bulk of my high school years not living with him. He'd be home for visits, and that was it. So I didn't have that buffer anymore, that protective figure who would, be the one to say to my parents, leave her be because she's doing the best that she can based on what she's actually able to do right now, what she's actually able to take on. And following, it was really funny because just before he left, following that, during that summer, was a little bit of a role reversal, because I had an Achilles tendon surgery to finally try and course correct some of the mobility issues I'd been dealing with throughout childhood. And he was the one who pushed me really hard in physio and in rehab to try and get me walking again, quicker and better because he, at the time, was working as a kinesiologist, and he was about to go to chiropractic college, right? And that was really, it's funny. I always tell this story. I'm like, it was the one and only time I ever dreaded him coming home, ever. And yet, to this day, I'm profoundly grateful for that, because he was the one that, the doctors were impressed with my progress and everything else. Well, when he left home, it was just my parents and I. And throughout my high school years, particularly when I started working part-time jobs and that, I had, I'd done retail. We have an amusement park here that needs extra help. Like it opens at May, but there's like a particular fair in the summers. So I did that for a couple summers. I actually taught piano for a year and kind of came away from that really having sympathy for my teacher for what she had put up with from me. And I said, yeah, I tried it. It's not for me, you know, but throughout all of that, I wanted more of that independence. And a lot of it also had to do with my social group. Unlike my brother, unlike two of my cousins actually, who are my age that I grew up with, I did not have a group in high school. I was what I term a social floater. So I kind of floated from group to group. And when I started working, I met like-minded, great people that I got along with really well. But according to my parents, there were two problems. Number one, they were older than me. Number two, they happened to be male. And this did not sit well with them, even though I said, I'm not sure what you were expecting when you had a son this much older than your daughter. Of course, I would be influenced and more comfortable talking to people older than me and spending time with them than I would be my own peer group, because our interests really aligned as well. My first summer job working at that fair, I met my best friend, who's still my best friend to this day, 20 years later. And my parents were not happy about any of that. They didn't trust him, and more so didn't trust my own judgment and my decision making, even though I never gave them any cause to worry. I mean, I still did my homework every day. I washed the dishes after dinner. I would help make dinner. There were things like if I came home after school, I could make my own meals and have them not worry about that. I could do the laundry. I knew how to budget myself from the jobs that I was doing. There was no cause for alarm. And yet, whenever I used to hang out with my buddy, there would be concessions like, I need you to write down the names and numbers of everybody you're spending time with. So I'd get to the transit hub and I'd look at my buddy and I go, okay, today, if anybody asks, you're 3 teenage girls. And he'd look at me and he'd go, okay, cool. So what movie are we watching? Yeah. And that was one thing too, that I felt that in finding my niche with people that were older than me, this was something that continued in university. What I found was acceptance, no judgment, and an ability to kind of build my own found family, my own sounding board from scratch in regards to this oppressiveness that I was really feeling in school, like at home and in school when I was in high school and into my university years as well. Just that, on a social level, I mean, I wasn't going out partying, but if I wanted, as a 19-year-old, to come home late, midnight on a Saturday, let's say, from dinner with friends, and I'd even have friends who would walk me to the door, the response I got was, we can't sleep until you get home. Oh, you're selfish for wanting to, even though I had safe ways to get home, I knew I could call them if I, ran into trouble and everything else. And on a professional level, academically, I was kind of being pushed towards, the hard sciences, the maths. My dad really wanted me to get into pharmacy because according to him it was good money and good hours, and um, because you belong to a union, it would make life a lot easier if any other disputes came up. And for me, when I got into university, I wasn't just thinking about how am I going to have a career. I was thinking about what am I going to enjoy learning? Because to me, this is because I also took a couple work experience semesters. I ended up doing my bachelor's in 5 years. So if this is 5 years of my life where I am spending this time in the lectures and cracking open the textbooks and everything else, what can I do that is going to bring me that joy of learning and absorbing that material and really connecting with my professors and my fellow students, but also set me up for a career.
And what did you end up doing at university?
I eventually decided on English and communications. Originally, it was just English. People kept hounding me about teaching. And having gone through teaching piano, I said, I'm not going to get my teaching degree and do English. So I tacked on communications because I thought, given that I've always loved storytelling, right? How can that translate? In addition to me just writing my own stories for fun, how can that translate to me helping other people get their stories out there? And that's how I got into the marketing communication side of things and really looking at analyzing media, analyzing ads, analyzing things like I still remember to this day, I took a marketing class back in high school that taught us when you walk into a store, there is a rhyme and reason to why everything is positioned the way it's positioned and to encourage certain traffic patterns. Same way with a commercial. How do they want people to feel? And academically, I sort of made my career in university analyzing these things. And it's something that I've carried now into my personal and professional life, where if I'm watching something, I'm listening to something, I'm always still analyzing the motives behind it, the emotions. What is it that you want people to feel and think about what it is that you're putting out there? And that's something that I do on a daily basis with my clients. Because
So today you're a PR coach and publicist. Who are you working for? Who are your clients?
My clients are primarily solopreneurs, creative entrepreneurs, filmmakers, authors. I've also worked with tourism brands and food brands and stuff like that as well. I've partnered with other agencies to work with larger projects in film, work with them on food events and things like that. And it's really about getting down to not just what your story is for me, but how do you want to tell it? Because a lot of what I come across when I speak to folks is a lot of self-consciousness, a lot of mindset blocks around sharing their own story and saying, why can't I just say I am this or I do this? And I tell them, because there's thousands of people out there that do exactly the same thing. In order to stand out, in order to have people trust you, most importantly, trust you enough to support you, whether it's, booking your service, buying your book, walking into your store, whatever it is, buying a ticket. they have to understand why you're doing it.
Mm.
And sometimes on an organizational level or on a film project level, it's a lot easier for them to lean into the inspiration or to lean into the impact they want to make, as opposed to when you're dealing with individuals like authors who are very much, I just want my book to do the talking for me, and that's it. Like, they don't need to know anything about me. And it's like, well, inevitably, people want to see the person behind the brand, because none of us are in relationships or businesses with brands, really. We buy into what we buy into, and we build the relationships we do because we trust the people behind those brands. So on a professional level, I'm always out there trying to educate people on the importance of that, and trying to do that for myself, because I was the same way too. I was banking on testimonials, results, all of this kind of thing to show people this is what I can do. Okay, that's what I can do, but that doesn't tell them anything about who I am and why they might want to work with me and what makes what I do different. And I kind of had to break out of my shell, because I made the decision of, if I am teaching people to walk the walk, but I'm not doing it, I'd be a hypocrite. So the best way for me to show them how it's done is to do it myself, and to learn along the way more about who I am as a professional, who I am on a personal level. And it's been incredibly freeing to go into every single workday, and even, on the days that I'm off, with the knowledge that I approach everything to the best of my ability that I'm able to at that time. And if I do that, if that is a cornerstone to my mindset, to my actions on a daily basis, then I'm good. It's going to be a good day. I can let go of everything else and just celebrate the day for what it is. Every single day, I show gratitude for where I've been, how far I've come, and then I think about where it is. I try to manifest where it is that I want to go, because it's really important to me to continue to pay it forward, to provide that value, to provide that education. And so much of this came from the fact that, no, I did not have support as an entrepreneur. I did not have understanding or even respect as one in my nuclear family, because they were so bound and determined that I was going to follow this rigid framework of achieving financial stability, that things like your mental health, productivity, rest, and certainly joy that you get out of the job never factored into it for them. It was more of I have this skill set. I happen to be good at it, or at least know what I'm doing. I'm going to stay in here until I retire, regardless of whether they were happy or not. And I did see a lot of unhappiness. I did see a lot of stress. I did see a lot of strife, even if it wasn't necessarily financially related. It was related to everything else, in regards to productivity, in regards to relationships, in regards to whether or not it was something that made them happy. And my philosophy is, especially in these past couple of years, is that life is too short to not embrace joy.
So today, you have a successful business, and what's your relationship like with your parents? How do they see your business?
They don't, to be honest. It is civil, but I learned very early on in my journey as an entrepreneur to put those boundaries in place, to, if I choose to share anything with them at all in relation to the journey, I know already what their response is going to be, that the focus should be finding a full-time position. And I don't, in the years since, so much has changed about the economy, so much has changed about how you find work. And certainly, much of the landscape that used to be where you could join a government position, you could join a company and be there for decades and have a good pension at the end of it is non-existent these days. It's very much non-existent. And, it's one of the reasons why I've just decided that, that is a no go zone for me. I will not speak to them about that sort of thing. At the end of everything, all they need to know is that I'm doing well. I'm busy, I'm doing well. And most importantly, at least for me, I'm happy. I'm fulfilled. And, you know, also, whether even, I think they always believe that me taking a different path would lead to so much instability. And one of the things that I've tried to impress upon them is that I've never once asked you for money. No matter what's been going on, no matter how I've struggled, and there have been struggles, you don't need to worry about me financially because I'm doing fine. Maybe it's not your definition of comfortable or healthy or what have you, but it works for me, right? And I think that it's been so important for me to put those boundaries in place and have those no-go zones, in order to maintain somewhat of a positive relationship when we do get together, when we do, have family dinners and we're able to laugh and share stories, of the past and things like that. And, I think it's really important to be able to respect myself enough to protect myself from negativity, from judgment, even if it is well-meaning. One of the early pieces of entrepreneurship advice that I got from mentors that I've learned from has been, if don't take advice from somebody who's never been there, because anything they tell you is not going to give you the answer that you need or that you're looking for to move forward. And that's been very, very true. Most of the mistakes that I've made in the journey of being an entrepreneur, I've made because my mindset was not in the right place. I was coming at it from a place of desperation. I was coming at it from a place of burnout, which was a really big one. And I followed the wrong advice out of desperation to try and get myself out of that situation. And I made those mistakes because I chose to do that.
Lilian, I suppose what I want to acknowledge is that it's just so strong in your story of how your parents were forged by the very difficult experiences that they had as children, and that that really forged their way of thinking, and how you then had to find yourself and push through and find your own way of being, almost against what their wishes and their desires for you. And I suppose what I want to do is acknowledge your courage in doing that, and also acknowledge your perseverance and your that you've managed to make a success of it despite not having your parents behind you. And also perhaps because your parents gave you a lot of skills in just persevering, in just keeping on going with the piano lessons, and in just working and working and working at it. And so it's almost as though you've managed to combine the freedom that you were looking for, the creative freedom that you were looking for, with a lot of the skills that your parents have given you. And I just think it's really worth acknowledging that. When I finish these interviews with two questions. So my first question is, has being a woman for you been positive, a negative, or neutral?
That's a question I think you could write an entire academic paper on, to be honest. I would say it's been mostly positive, primarily because building my business the way that I have, where I've countered the sexism and some of the misogyny was my attempts to go in-house. That's where I encountered those issues. But with my business, I have never once had an instance where someone has discounted me, my experiences, or my knowledge because I'm a woman or I'm a person of color. And if they have chosen not to listen to me, it's not me. It's the fact that their mindset was not ready to take on the discipline of working on public relations and sharing their story. That was really what it came down to. It was not a reflection on me. And I've come to realize that because I come from a place of privilege in the sense that I am financially sound, going through school, I never had to worry about student loans and things like that. I want to make it my role, my purpose moving forward to really pay it forward to open up those opportunities. I mean, going back to what we talked about before we started recording about how I've made it my job, the best that I can, to make sure that if I see a good opportunity, the people I believe that it's right for don't miss out on it. That's what I try to do from my place of privilege, where I don't have to worry about putting food on the table. I don't have to worry about paying back loans or anything. This is what I can do to help other women just like me have those opportunities to push forward, because I know I wouldn't be here if I didn't have the mentors that I've had. I didn't have the people who were willing to take chances on me to give me that work experience when I was still building my portfolio. And I want to do what I can to make sure that the others out there have those opportunities.
Lilian, I wonder, my last question is, do you have a message for listeners? I wonder if that is your message, but perhaps you've got something to add to that.
Just that in whatever you're doing, whether it is learning a new hobby, taking your first step out there and wanting to share your story, when you're looking at building a PR campaign, whatever it is that you're doing, this is what I tell clients all the time. And that is, take it one word at a time, one step at a time. Everything is overwhelming when you look at the big picture right away. What makes it so much easier is if you break it down into bite-sized chunks and go, okay, today for half an hour, what can I do to move the needle forward? That makes it that much more manageable. That makes it easier for you to look at it and go, this fits within the paradigm of my schedule, my energy levels, my mindset. And it makes it that much more empowering every single time you finish a piece of that and continuing to move the progress forward. I always say to clients, I said, every little bit of progress should be celebrated. And when I say celebrated, I don't mean throw yourself a party, but, it could be, hey, look at the clock. So what if it's 2:30 in the afternoon? I'm off for the day. I'm going to treat myself to, some chocolate, and I'm going to read a good book, and it's going to be a good day. That's what I think that as a society, and particularly as women, we don't do enough of. We're always pushed and taught to continue to keep going, to push through illness, to push through burnout, to push through, always prioritizing other responsibilities ahead of ourselves. We are not taught to celebrate ourselves enough. And that's what I try to change in my business and on a personal level.
Well, Lilian, I'd like to celebrate you and celebrate all that you've achieved. I think it's fantastic. And thank you so much for your time on the podcast. It's been great.
Thank you for having me, Cecilia.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Brave New Women. Certain podcast sites such as Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or Podchaser let you leave a rating and a review. The more ratings and reviews we get, the more people will listen and the more these women's stories will be shared. So I'd really appreciate it if you could. Thanks for listening.